This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with life science experts and discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome Cliff Campbell, Principal and Consultant of Cliff Campbell Consulting, calling in from Cork, Ireland. Great to have you with us today, Cliff.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be with you, Stacey.
We are excited to talk about this concept that you have come up with recently around process validation or for PV, intrinsic compliance, which the title doesn't do it justice, because in the life science industries, when we think of compliance, we think of one thing, and this is actually something completely different, which we will certainly get into. But Cliff, as mindsets are shifting and validation professionals are evolving, we're seeing it all over. There's a quality culture growing out there, in large part due to critical thinking and leveraging of past practices and activities. And process understanding and control strategy and life cycle, those are all the new big buzzwords. They're the stars of the shows these days. And this whole concept of 3 batches and you're done is really, moving off the stage. And so today we're going to talk about these new ways of thinking across the industry that aim to ensure appropriate, risk-based, least burdensome validation with a focus on validation activities, the actual activities, instead of the traditional, check the box, are we compliant mentality. So Cliff, before we do dive in on this topic of intrinsic compliance, can you give us an overview of the current regulations for process validation in pharma?
Yeah, certainly, Stacey. Start with that. It goes back to 1987 in the States. The FDA, the initial FDA guidance on process validation was dated in 1987, and it was revised in 2011. The corresponding guidance in Europe is from the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. They have a number of annexes, actually, but the fundamental one, the main one, is Annex 15, which talks about qualification and validation. And both the States and Europe and other jurisdictions as well. I'm primarily about Europe and the States in this talk, but the other jurisdictions have their own annexes. World Health Organization has annexes. South American countries have their own view, but then. And before I go on, there are a couple of additional guidances in Europe in and around process validation for biotech, process validation for finished products, and again, similarly in the States, there's an FDA guidance for sterile manufacture, aseptic processing. But the two main ones, I think, that are illustrative of the current status of the industry would be the FDA guide number 1. And its European counterpart. They're all saying the same thing, really, even though they use slightly different terminology. They're all now talking about life cycle. Right. The revised guidances are very much, they see validation as a process rather than a standalone event. And so you're talking about process design would be the first stage of 3-stage PV from an FDA point of view. Performance qualification would be part 2, and physical qualification of the facility and the physical systems would be a component or a kind of prelude to process performance qualification. And then there's a thing called CPV, continued process verification, which is really ongoing monitoring of your commercial batches post qualification. So they're the guidances, and there were a couple of things, I guess, to say about it. The guidance is really the validation world is divided into 2 work streams, and that's reflected in the typical org chart of a regulated organization, a regulated entity. You have a qualification group who would be primarily responsible for qualifying the physical asset, the physical infrastructure, manufacturing systems, and they do IQ, OQ, and some to a certain extent perform. IQ is installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification. The other work stream then is process validation or performance qualification, depending on your terminology. And the second work stream is primarily, it almost exclusively belongs to the manufacturer. The physical qualification activity very often is outsourced to contractors, but the regulated industry and regulated entity is somewhat more responsible, I guess, for qualification as it gets closer to the product.
Right, but also
another work stream that I suppose will be working in the automation aspect. So you have the physical manufacturing process, and you have the automation systems that are supporting the process. And there's another, there are ISB guidances out there, good engineering, good automated manufacturing practice. It's not a regulation, but it's an industry guideline.
Sure.
And then there are ICH, the International Council on Committee on Harmonization. That's a voluntary organization made up primarily of manufacturers, but regulators are in there as well. They do great work, really. I'd have to say, in terms of bridging the gap between the regulated, between the regs on the one hand and industry interpretation on the other. And there are 5 or 6 guidances there, for example, relating to process development, risk assessment, pharmaceutical quality management system. And there's one just recently, it's hot off the press, only a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, on life cycle. So there is quite a plethora of regulation and guidance in support of validation. And finally, I guess what I should say semantically, just on a point, Stacey, technically speaking, we're talking about guidances that they are effectively regs in the sense that you would ignore them at your peril, but legalistically speaking, they're guidances, and they sit underneath, in the States, they sit underneath the Code of Federal Regulation, and in Europe, they sit underneath a series of directives.
Right. And the expectation is that these are rules to be followed, even though they're called guidances. The expectation is that they're rules. And while we see some nuances and variations from country to country, most regulators, I think, have moved to this whole life cycle approach, as you mentioned, and a risk-based, more of a risk-based focus, rather than the check the box kind of focus. So I think as an industry, we're evolving, and we see it reflected in some of the guidances and regulations that are coming out. Now, Cliff, back, to pull it back a little bit, with traditional validation as we know it, we have in the past, and to some extent still do, rely heavily on documentation to prove compliance. And it's been treated as a tedious, mysterious, complex activity. Can you provide some context here for our listeners? Why is validation such a beast?
Well, again, it probably goes back to 1987. Again, Stacey, the initial FDA guidance was issued in response to non-compliance and product recalls by industry. So the industry-regulator relationship was quite antagonistic from the get-go. It was the industry, the regs were being imposed on industry, and I think that mindset then, that relationship, or that kind of attitude, if you like, in terms of the industry regulatory relationship, that had ramifications then, or it kind of percolated through the industry to the extent that what happened in response to the FDA guidance, is that quality assurance departments pretty much took ownership of the interpretation of the guidance, and validation groups were set up then to qualify the physical facilities and to validate the processes, and the, how should I say, the remaining engineering departments, for example, were very much excluded from that. and there was no real little or no trust, if you like, between the validation groups, the QA people, and the engineering groups. So rightly or wrongly, the interpretation of the guidance was very conservative and based on compliance, really, and as we were seeing this kind of thing. So they were fundamentally based on fear of the regulator. And I think that really, that point of view or that mindset has pretty much prevailed right ever since. There are, I guess, within industry, then there would be there were two camps, I guess. There are people who are still very much conservative and reactionary in their worldview, and they would still see the relationship with the agency quite antagonistic, and then internal rivalry and almost hostility between departments. It exists in many companies. The other side of the equation really is that and I don't have the stats on this, but there are very many companies who are far more progressive in their outlook and have embraced the regulations.
Sure.
But the fundamental problem really, as I say, was down to fear of the regulator and mistrust of subject matter experts by quality, and the fact that what happened, I guess, again, rightly or wrongly, Stacey, is that opportunistically, to a certain extent, a consulting industry kind of piggybacked the regulations, and you end up in a situation where the qualification, how should I say, the cost of validating or qualifying a new facility is almost as much as the engineering costs. So it can be very, very enormous, and that's about the size of it, really.
Okay. Yeah, no, and I agree. And I mean, I know documentation, and a lot of it had to do with just really the checks and balances, right? And so we're trying to keep track of it. And I think as in the industry, we are, as I mentioned, and you mentioned, we are seeing a shift sort of in these mindsets that you have described. And what I'm seeing is, for example, we've heard computer systems validation folks their teams are shifting to more of a computer systems assurance approach, and that is being backed by the FDA. They have new guidance coming out where they are making the shift on paper, not just in practice. And so their focus is going more from that check the box sort of mentality to, hey, let's build this in from the beginning. And I think we are starting to see a similar culture shift in process validation. And this ties in beautifully with your idea of intrinsic compliance. So why do you think this evolution or this shift, if you will, in thinking and mindsets is happening now?
Well, it's actually been around for quite a while. It goes back, as far as I can gather, it goes back to 2006. Quite a long time ago now, 14 or 15 years ago, FDA published a guidance on essentially system-based inspections and quality systems approach to GMP regulations, but it's known affectionately as the system-based inspections guidance. And what that does really, it's a very simple, an elegant concept. It's got a nice kind of a Venn diagram representation there, where your quality system sits on top, and then you've got 5 subsidiary systems underneath. So the production system, facilities and equipment, laboratory controls, material systems, and packaging and labeling. All sort of subservient, so to speak, or all under the umbrella of quality. So that guidance, which is 15 years old, 14 years old, is already talking about a systems-based approach. So and time passes, I guess. That penny finally dropped with industry, I guess, but it was reinforced then. If you look at FDA guidance in 2011, FDA guidance in 2011 talks about control strategy as a vehicle to compliance, and or to compliance from a process validation point of view, at least. But So if you look at the language in and around the control strategy was originally defined in ICH Q10. And what control strategy does is that it actually points the finger back more or less verbatim to those 5 or 6 systems that I mentioned from the 2006 guidance. So there you are. You have a guidance 2006, which talks about systems-based approach, and then that's been kind of reinforced or validated, so to speak, by the contents of the FDA guide. And for similar movements or similar language, similar points of view emerging in Europe. I guess it just took a little while for the industry to realize that this whole thing is systematic and systemic. And in fairness to the ICH authors, their worldview is very, very systematic and structured as well. So it's not really as new as the question might suggest. It's just perhaps that the industry, the speed of uptake by the industry or certain quarters of the industry may not have been as sort of rapid as it ought to have been.
Right, I would agree. I don't think these are brand new concepts, but I think they're more global shifts within the industry. And so the expectations are changing. And I think if you wait long enough, Cliff, everything that's old will become new again at some point, right? So
present company excluded, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if companies then have been designing these robust processes and performing ongoing vigilant monitoring all along, or at least for the last several decades, what are the biggest obstacles then that you see or can identify in moving as an organization from this reactive mindset to a much more proactive one?
Yeah, well, I'd first of all, I'd be quite optimistic about where we are right now in that sort of journey. Or I would say I've been at it a long time. I'm in this industry well over 30 years, but I do feel we're close to a tipping point. I really do. Thomas Kuhn, philosopher of science, talks about paradigm shift, and this is a long time ago, but he says, in order for the penny to finally drop, you really have to have lots and lots of people coming to the same realization at the same time. And I think we're a classic example of that. So I'm optimistic in terms of the removal of these obstacles that I'm just going to talk about now. I think the main obstacle is cultural, or you could call it strategic. And what I mean by that really is that the industry is typically divided when it comes to change or interpretation or the acceptance of new regulation. I think the industry is divided into, I would say, 3 categories. It's pretty standard stuff, really, Stacey. But you have the leaders. You have the people who are sort of evangelical about the change and will champion it, and will blaze a trail with it. And they would be in a small minority. And Jerry Migliaccio, a buddy of mine who retired from Pfizer a few years ago, was a classic example of that. He had the courage, and it began with him as an individual, even though he was working for a pretty enormous company. But he had the courage of his convictions to realize that there was an intelligent way of interpreting FDA expectation. And he, as a result of that, he actually succeeded in influencing FDA policy in many areas. So I think the first thing really is to categorize your organization. Are we leaders? Are we followers? Or are we deniers? So I think that's the first thing really, and that probably applies to employees as well. If you're a department head, or you're a section head, or if you're a validation engineer or scientist, I think it would be a good sort of thing to do to categorize yourself and your organization in terms of where we at organizationally and personally in terms of the acceptance of change. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, it absolutely makes sense. And I think, in any industry, you're going to have those leaders, those early onboarders who push to bring a new concept, a new method, a new process to the industry. And this is not an exception. Certainly I think that there's been a traditional slowness to pharma, like in terms of how quickly they are able to adopt new ideas, new concepts, new ways of doing things. And that's obviously for a variety of reasons. And I wonder what your thoughts are on lessons learned, or can we learn from other industries who have done it well and done it much more quickly than we have in pharma. I'm thinking the auto industry for one, maybe the oil industry. I mean, we hear about them adopting new technologies and moving much more swiftly through this sort of mindset shift.
Yeah. By the way, can I back up a little bit and just maybe go back? Yeah, if I don't mind, I'll just go back to the previous question. I'll try to remember that question, but I'll go back to the previous question in terms of, I gave you kind of a general answer to it in terms of culture and mindset. But more specifically, in terms of obstacles, the opposite. And again, I'd be optimistic about this, even though I'm itemizing them as obstacles. I think they're very easily fixed.
Sure.
I think the first obstacle is the org chart. If your org chart is vertical, you should be converting it into a matrix. And I'd be pretty kind of fast about this. I could spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about each of these points, but I think you understand where I'm coming from. Another obstacle would be what I would call proprietary ownership of the regs. But what tends to happen in many companies, again, there were some exceptions to this, but in most cases, regulatory affairs own the regulations from a corporate point of view. And what happens then is that corporate guidances or guidelines and policies are prepared based on a translation of the reg, an interpretation of the reg, and sometimes they can be misaligned and they can be outdated. I think that's another obstacle, and an avoidable obstacle. Speed of response in how should I say, interpreting and deploying new regulations. I'll give you a classic example of that, and maybe just a rhetorical question for your listeners. How many of your listeners have a policy or an SOP in place in support of control strategy? It's a kind of a Cinderella sort of component of validation, which I'll maybe talk about later on. It's a very, very powerful interface between the various stages of validation. But I'm citing it as an example that almost 10 years later, many companies that I have encountered haven't sort of given control strategy recognition, so I think that's another obstacle, sort of a unnecessary inertia, if you like, or sluggishness or lack of intelligence, really, in interpreting the regs. And the other one, the other one there, I guess the final one would be the sort of preservation of the status quo. That's an obvious obstacle.
Right.
Especially if you're in an organization where the age profile is, let's say you've got lots of people approaching retirement, for example. Again, there are exceptions to this, but very often what happens in that type of situation is that people don't want to be bothered or with the hassle of all of the rigmarole of converting existing document sets and policies, which go through all sorts of approval processes. Don't really have the energy or the inclination to make that effort. So there. But again, just to go back and go. But the good news, I think, having said all of that, I still maintain we're extremely close to a tipping point. There's no doubt about it.
We have these obstacles. None of them are insurmountable. They're just based on. I mean, it sounds, and listening to you describe them, it just sounds like they're really based on people being protective of their job, of the piece of the pie that they have control over, and so it's broadening that mindset, getting folks to work together across the life cycle, really in teams, and a lot of these issues then sort of resolve themselves. It sounds like.
And if I go back to the just one example there, maybe we'll pick it up in a later question. But in terms of the org chart, converting the org chart into a matrix, I mean there are various ways of doing that. You can. I have a strong preference. The industry is very, very fixated, if you like, on the role of SMEs, subject matter experts, and I recognize I realize they're a necessity. I'm not trying to trivialize biotech manufacture, for example, but by any means. But on the other hand, I'm a bit believer in what I would call general practitioners. It's a skill set that we don't really. Maybe in the smaller companies, people are doing it, but I've never seen. I haven't seen. I don't think I've ever seen an example of a situation where one general practitioner, to use that sort of acronym, followed the entire 3-stage life cycle from beginning to end. And I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen. But I guess what does happen then as a kind of an equivalent to that is that, again, getting away from the silo thing, I think it's worthwhile spending a minute or two in silos. What people do obviously is that they form teams, project teams, for that follow the molecule, so to speak, from beginning to end. And that's pretty much what I mean by matrix. But if you're absolutely vertical and you're absolutely silo based, you have to define handshakes between those silos. That's what I would mean by if I'm talking about the removal or the elimination of an obstacle in an extremely vertical organization. Then I'm saying you have to have handshakes and you have to have handshakers.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I don't think we do our best work when we are in silos. I think there needs to be collaboration across teams. I think you need your subject matter experts. But to your point, you also need your project managers, the people who are chasing the different tasks and monitoring things as they move from one phase to the next, all the way through. And I think both are very important, and it's as well as all of the other people doing their various jobs. And it's extra important that they're all collaborating, that they're working together.
And in the old days, in the old days, what was absolutely sacrosanct then was, and still, I don't want to come across as preaching total revolution here, but in the old days, the role of the document management system, of the document management manager, sort of specialist, was absolutely sacrosanct. And I think going forward, I think the role of the data custodian is going to be far more important. But maybe we can talk about that later.
So back to your point, or back to my other question. Sure. Then, do other industries or groups of organizations, are there lessons to be learned from this in terms of this whole breaking down the silos, flattening your organizational chart, and really producing a more team approach or a more collaborative approach? And are we seeing that in other industries? And can we incorporate some of those lessons learned into what we're doing here in pharma?
Yeah, I think we can. I think whenever I reflect on pharma, biopharma compared to other industries and do benchmarking, it kind of falls into two categories for me, and I think it's worth kind of maybe talking about both of them. The first one is the actual process itself, the manufacturing process itself. So pharma, for the most part, is a batch process. Now, that's not unique. Brewing, distilling, they're batch processes, but it's a batch process and it's highly regulated. So, there are, take the example of biotech, which is typically divided into upstream and downstream processing. And now this applies for small molecule as well, which would be more to do with chemical synthesis. But just stick with biotech as an example. It's kind of fragmented almost by design. You have upstream and downstream. The upstream operations, cell culture, bioreaction, and all the rest of it. So some of those operations are potentially continuous within their own boxes, so to speak. But when you go downstream and you're going into chromatography and filtration, they're all very much batch processes in their own right. But regardless of the composition of the process train, what I'm really getting at there is that I think the best you can hope for in terms of what I would call process manufacturing continuity. I don't think we're ever, I'm talking about manufacturing today. I'm not talking about in 10 or 20 years' time. I'm talking about the situations that I find myself in this week and next week and this year.
Of course.
I think today, the pharma biotech sort of model, the manufacturing model is fragmented almost by definition. Another point of fragmentation really, and it's hard to do, the point of getting at really is it's hard to do optimization on a fragmented process. That's really, I guess, what I'm getting at. But another point of fragmentation then is the distinction between drug substance and drug product manufacturing. They're the two main categories of molecule, if you like, or of manufacturing, should I say, from an agency point of view and from a manufacturing point of view. And very often what happens is that the drug substance is, or in the old days you would call it the active pharmaceutical ingredient, but the drug substance is manufactured in one location and may well be shipped to another factory or even another country for finished purposes. So there are all sorts of challenges, I think, in and around trying to sort of compare a regulated batch manufacturing scenario with other sort of with say oil refining. I began my life with Exxon way back in the day. I was a control systems engineer with Exxon, and we were doing all sorts of fancy process analytical technology on the various streams, and it was very easy to optimize that because you had crude oil in the one end and you had gasoline out the other end, and it was literally a continuous process. But then, having said all of that, that's what I would call process manufacturing continuity. And by the way, before I leave that, just so that people may not realize it, there is the ICH people again have issued a concept paper on continuous manufacturing.
Right.
I think it came out. ICH Q13, I think it came out a couple of years ago. It's still only a concept paper, but at least it shows that people within the industry are researching the potential for continuous manufacturing.
Absolutely. No, it's part of the whole AI, automation, machine learning, big data.
Oh, yeah. And that sits very nicely with this. And again, this is very futuristic, but nevertheless, future has to arrive at some point. But I know you guys had a podcast last year on Pharma 4.0, for example, and that whole thing about the Internet of Things. Very, very sort of avant-garde, but nevertheless exciting stuff. And so that's the first part of it, really. And I think it's hard to sort of find sort of equivalent situations in other industries from the point of view of making meaningful comparisons.
I would agree. And obviously the stakes are a lot higher in pharma because we're looking at patient safety, right? So But
if I come back to the second part of the answer then, Stacey, which is probably the more interesting one, really, if you want to talk about sort of what we can learn by way of life cycle integration and life cycle management techniques from other industries, I can quote a couple. Yeah, you hinted at them yourself earlier, the automotive sector, the aeronautics sector, industrial engineering in general. They use a technique that I think is really cool. It's called multiple bill of materials, the acronym MBOM. And what they do is that they hierarchically model the various sort of phases of the life cycle of the manufactured object, the object to be manufactured. So they would have 3 or 4 at minimum. They would have a physical model of the system. That's a little bit like SAP. It's almost like a kind of an asset register for the actual bill of materials, really, in the traditional sense of all of the componentry associated with that particular complex artifact. So, and then they would have a corresponding model in parallel with that, but somewhat it would interrelate with it, but it would look very different. It would be the functional model. What are all of the functions? Think of a car. The first one would be the physical components, and the next thing, what are all the things that I do with the car? And in the static mode. And then the third one would be the performance BOM, which would be the actual car in motion, so to speak. And I think they have a fourth one. I think this is cool, but we don't have anything that approximates to it. The fourth one then would be for the maintenance representation. Because what are the spare parts that are, if I want to maintain this particular artifact, what are the things that I, what are the things that I actually replace? I don't replace components. I might replace sets of components. So that whole concept of a multiple bill of materials. But what those guys do, Stacey, is that they use those models then to auto-generate the life cycle documentation, and that's really cool. What we do is we use word processors and literature to describe our complex objects, which I think is archaic. You know, I really do, in terms of a typical. No,
and so,
go ahead.
To that point, Cliff, you have come up with, you've done a lot of thinking on this, and you've come up with a concept, which we're calling intrinsic compliance. And I want you to be able to introduce that to our listeners, and then talk about what are some of the first steps maybe in making a shift more towards this this concept that you are discussing.
Okay, again, I'm breaking all the rules of interview, but I'm going to, just by way of closing the last question, again, I want to end on an optimistic note on the previous question, Stacey, if I may.
Sure.
There's a model within science, actually, or within medical science, which it's called the Gene Ontology. So it's actually part of our industry, and so gene researchers have developed this open source hierarchical model. It's analogous to the multiple bill of materials, but basically it's a taxonomy, or it's a catalog of molecular, cellular, and biological components at the genetic level. And in some respects, that's absolute. At the product level, it's synonymous with what we do. You know, it's not just that model has sort of equivalence. I think in some cases it's identical to what we do as manufacturers. So if I was looking for a sort of a paradigm or a kind of a basis or a prototype for jazzing up knowledge management with our industry, I think I would go back to the Gene Ontology, and then jumping forward to your next question. For what I did then, and reflecting on all of this stuff, as I said, you know, why don't you develop? And this is in the paper that I'm submitting to JVT.
Right.
Why don't you prepare something with analogous to the periodic table, you know, the chemical table of the elements, where you itemize your process components on one column, or on the vertical, your physical components on the horizontal, and you just try to develop a periodic table which summarizes your entire knowledge base, and that goes back to Mendeleev. So I think there are, as a contribution to initiating a kind of something akin to a step change in our industry's thinking on knowledge management. I haven't included the Gene Ontology in my paper, but I've included a provisional prototype, a periodic table for people to consider. And that's all. Again, that's all by way of kind of prelude to the question that you asked me about intrinsic compliance. And by the way, I just came up with intrinsic compliance when I was walking the dog during shutdown. You know, I've been locked down. I've been subject to lockdown like many other people, and I've kind of turned it into a sabbatical. So all of these things were kind of brewing they were gestating in my mind, and I came up. I'm not sure that intrinsic quality is a better term, because I know that compliance has GMP connotations.
Right.
But provisionally, and I'm open to suggestion, by the way, provisionally at least, I've come up with the idea that the main point is that the quality attributes of any sort of physical component or of any process parameter ought to be available, and to be very, very integrated and very, very structured and available from the very beginning of the life cycle. And that's kind of that I'm getting at with that strap line, intrinsic compliance. But as I say, I'm open to suggestion as to whether I should rename it. But then, would I just continue with the sort of the background to where it came from?
So right, and the name aside, this is what you're calling it for now. I mean, you may decide later that it makes more sense to call it something else. But basically, tell us what the gist is, and then talk to us about starting to make a shift as an industry towards more intrinsic compliant mindset, because I think it's very interesting.
Okay. Well, okay. Again, there's a little bit of kind of prelude here. The things that drivers, if you like, were 3 or 4 drivers that stimulated me. I was always kind of irked by Dr. Janet Woodcock's exhortation that we should, as an industry, and and including the regulator, by the way, she included FDA in the statement, but collectively we should be far more efficient, agile, and flexible. That was one thing. I wanted to get beyond the rhetoric on that statement. That was one thing. And that statement has been around a long, long time. Another one then was far more recent. It was only a couple of months old. I was interested to read the U.S. medical response to COVID, and there's a thing, and it came out of Star Trek, really, but they're calling it the Warp Speed Initiative.
Operation Warp Speed, right?
And I said again, I wanted to get beyond that rhetoric, and I said, okay, if is urging us to be efficient, agile, and flexible, and warp speed is more than a metaphor. I'm an engineer. If you're talking warp speed, I'll talk particle acceleration. Can we do some acceleration at the validation level? So that was another stimulus, if you like.
I love that. That is a great way to describe it.
Yeah, thank you. And then the third one was personal. I was very keen. As I said, I've been around a long time. I'm still very energized by it, but I was very adamant. I had a determination to bring validation back to first principles, technical, testable first principles.
Sure.
And then there's and final one then is kind of a tongue-in-cheek one. And I'm from Cork, which is the rebel county in Cork, and we have a reputation for rebellion, our non-acceptance of the status quo. So that was part of it as well. Just to kind of not to take the current sort of industry mindset or interpretation of the regs at face value and try to do something with a little bit, and I don't mean this in any arrogant way, but something with a bit more intelligence. So that's the kind of the background. The intrinsic compliance, it's a little, again, to go back to sort of a physics, and it's a bit like fusion. But basically, if I take the example of, and there are several other examples of this, if we have time at the end, I'll allude to, but I wouldn't want people to think that this is the only example. But the prime example, really, if as a process, if you take two people in a design team, you've got the process person, you've got the project person. The process person, amongst other things, needs to measure temperature at a particular time, at a particular location. And so he or she will specify criteria associated with that expectation. It's typically buried in a user requirement specification, word processor type of thing. And his or her engineering counterpart independently will design a physical system, and one of the components in that system will be an instrument that measures temperature. So on the one hand, you've got the process person, what I would call a process part. Part of his operation is the measurement parameter, in this case, the measurement of pressure or temperature, whatever, at a particular point in time. And the physical engineering group, the people responsible for delivering the facility, have a component that is being presented as a candidate for that measurement. And what typically happens, Stacey, is that those two work streams are totally independent, and they come together during qualification, and very often the process person is disappointed at the non-performance of the physical object. So there's all sorts of gap analysis and remediation to be done. And all I've done really, and to me this is kind of a eureka moment, believe it or not, Stacey. All I'm saying is, why don't you bring those two elements together at first and say, rather than say I've got a process parameter in one bucket, so to speak, and I've got an instrument in another bucket, why don't you bring them together and actually almost treat them as what I would call a composite object or a manufacturing element, which is it's a single entity which is made up of what you might call a prefix and a suffix in terms of its identification.
Sure.
So, and all I'm saying is that assign the relational data and the risk flags then to that sort of combination or that pairing, and use that as the basis of kickstarting your validation life cycle. And it also satisfies. This penny only kind of dropped with myself this morning. It also satisfies all of the criteria of control strategy. If you were to print out all of those sort of data sheets for those composite objects, you'd have your control strategy commitment nailed. Almost sort of, it would come along for the ride. I think that is the essence of intrinsic compliance. The recognition that process parts and what I would call facility counterparts should be kind of merged at birth and with data sets assigned. And finally, Stacey, I think it's worth saying that in many cases, in all cases really, unless you're talking about an existing facility and you're nominating a process to run on an existing facility. But if you're talking about designing a new facility, in most cases, those physical counterparts or facility counterparts won't even exist at that point of at the beginning of the life cycle. But you can still assign placeholders for those objects, and rather than having to endure a kind of a hide and go seek across documentation across the life cycle, why don't you just bring it together and let that be the primary source of verification? That's the insight, and whether intrinsic compliance is the right descriptor or not is kind of an open question.
Sure. So the terminology aside, essentially you're saying from the very beginning, let's take the process parameters and our expectations of what needs to happen and match them up with the resources we need and what's going to be done on the production end. And let's make sure we have a plan for this, not in an isolated plan for each process in silos, but a more integrated
absolutely.
Plan.
And by the way, I think I'm jumping around a little bit, but this is okay. I was going to, at the end of the chat, I was going to talk about the other scenarios, but I think this would be a good time to do that now.
Sure.
Just so that listeners can understand the validity and the flexibility of the technique. It's not just to do with process parameters and physical instruments. It also has benefits for the operational side of the startup. It's not just the designers that benefit. So I'll just give you 2 or 3 other examples, really, of what I would call a composite object. The one we've spoken about is the relationship between the parameter and the instrument. Another one is the relationship between what people would call the in-process control and the sample. And in-process control is a kind of a transient measure. It's an interim measurement of your quality, of your critical quality attribute of the final product. But it's not at the end of the entire trade. It's a kind of an interim measurement that gives you an indication as to whether or not the final attributes will be achieved. And for the most part, Stacey, those measurements require a sample to be taken. Temperature is measured dynamically online. It's measured all day, every day. The verification of in-process controls requires physical samples to be taken. And again, I think listeners can kind of understand that. I hope they can make the leap in terms of what will be the relational data, then in terms of ensuring that the sample system satisfies the in-process control expectation. That's an example. So, and another example, then maybe a final one would be on the finished product. You have a target product profile for the product that will be made up of a series of, maybe you could say 20, 30 or so critical quality attributes. Each of those quality attributes is a process part, for example, but each of them would require an analytical method and an analytical device in the laboratory to actually satisfy the requirement. So those 3 examples, if you like, hopefully will demonstrate the kind of the versatility and the efficiency of the technique. The first one being the parameter in the instrument, the second one being the in-process control in the sample, and the third one being the assay and the analyzer. And there are a few more in the paper. I don't have time to go through them now. I just wanted to get that on
And we will have links for the listeners to the paper that you've submitted, as well as some of the other resources that we're talking about today. So no,
cool.
Not to worry there. But you know what you're describing is a very it's taking the data and the processes really, and then comparing those to sort of the risks on the other end, and working out ways to mitigate all of that before you really even get going in the life cycle. So being very proactive in your approach.
Yeah, and it also, what it also does, Stacey, the content, with the whole point in our the mechanism, if you like, between getting from the identification of what I would call manufacturing elements. The next step then is the assignation of relational data and risk flags to those objects, and we'll talk about that shortly, I hope. Relational data and risk flags, they can be based on, those data sets, if you like, will you learn from your experience. So if stuff happens on a project, then you want to embed that into your model for the subsequent project. So it's a very kind of it's a very configurable rather than cast in stone mindset.
Absolutely. So, and speaking of knowledge, right? You're learning as you go. This is like the whole. I mean, really, this is definitely in my mind related to knowledge management. So, how can we use the relational data and the risk flags to create this, more proactive approach? Then.
Yeah. Okay. I go back to my. I'll go back to my example. The technique is valid for the other examples as well. But if I go back to my parameter example, what I'm really saying is that the information transfer between the process owner and the facility designer, I'm saying that each of these objects or pairings will have relational data on the one hand, and will have risk flags on the other. So in the case of the parameter instrument relationship, the relational data, these are my positives, these are the things I want to achieve.
Yep.
I'd be interested in the set point, what's the target value of the temperature measurement at that point in the process? What are the units of measurement? These are no-brainers really, but they're the things that make validation.
Right?
Yeah, so set point of the value of the parameter, and units of measurement. What's the operating range of that particular? Is the target value absolute, or does it have a range? Is there a regulated range, proven acceptable range in the submission? What's the resolution of the measurement? Am I measuring it to 1 or 2 or 3 decimal points? What's the duration of the measurement? Am I measuring it instantaneously, or do I have to measure it over a period of time? All of that good stuff. That's all relational data, and that would all then find its way into the various protocols. And I guess what it competes with really, it's just another way to the same end. All of that stuff really would be it's currently buried in user requirement specifications, and I'm simply saying with the same content, make it more data centric. Convert it from a document to a data set. That's what I'm saying, really.
Right. So it streamlines the whole process. It's easy to
absolutely. It makes it far more transparent as well. And then the flip side, if you like, the negative side, the pessimistic side of the dialogue between the parameter and the instrument, then are the risk flags. So what's at risk there really? Process instability. Is the measurement, is the process stable at that point in time, or is the measurement all over the place? Obviously that's going to have an impact on the metrology people. Measurement uncertainty, that's a term in metrology that if the actual instrument probe is incapable of stable measurement, that's something that the process person would need to know about. False alarms. Can the process person tolerate false alarms? And then material incompatibility, the material of construction of the probe that's exposed to the process fluid, is the process fluid and the material of construction compatible? Are they compatible? So that's really what I'm getting at. It's just simplification and standardization of the exchange of validation-related information between customer and user, if you like, or customer and designer at the point of process inception.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, Cliff, in your paper, you use the term feed forward. You talk about the concept of feed forward. And I know that's mentioned in ICH Q10, is it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Right. As this seems to be critical to quality management, can you talk a little bit more about that concept as it applies to the intrinsic compliance that you're talking about here?
Yeah. I can, of course, Stacey. Feed forward and feedback go hand in hand. And again, if you want to kind of simplify it from a layperson's point of view, feedback and feed forward are just two sides of a conversation. But and what we're talking about here is a technical conversation between the process people and the project people. CHQ10 has a very elegant definition of it. Feed forward is defined as the modification or control of a process using its anticipated results or effects. So there's a very strong sense of prediction about the definition. You're anticipating a measurement rather than waiting for a measurement to occur. The typical model for technical process control would be based on feedback, where you measure a temperature, you compare it to a set point, and you modify your heat source then based on the extent of the error. Feed forward is more predictive, and it's used in bioreactor control systems. It's also used if you have, and this, I think this is more aspirational than real, based on my experience, but it's used in a minority of cases. It's used if you've got process analytical technology, measuring your material attributes, your raw material attributes at the start of a process. You can use that information to modify set points at the parameter level, down, for example, during granulation, that the moisture content of a material might have an effect on the duration of the granulation step. That's an example of feed forward at the technical level. But from the point of view of intrinsic compliance, what the ICH people said was feed forward can be applied technically in process control, which is what I've just been sort of describing, or conceptually in quality management. And I said, bingo. But when I read that, I said, yeah, okay, I've got ICH Q10 on my side. So basically, what I've been discussing is a combination of those two sort of scenarios, the technical and quality related. So what I'm doing is just to repeat, I'm taking quality related technical requirements and I'm feeding them forward from process owners to facility designers and operators at the very outset of the life cycle.
Right, and you're not doing this in a silo, right? You're not doing this in a silo. So you're taking that knowledge, that information you have, and you're feeding it forward so that they can be more proactive in terms of mitigating any sort of risks that might exist before they happen, as opposed to the reactionary where we see CAPAs and recalls and that
exactly,
kind of stuff.
And just to square that circle a little bit in terms of it being a kind of a two-way thing, feedback then, I as a process person may have an idealistic expectation of a facility, but there may be physical practicalities that will prevent that sort of aspiration being achieved. So what I'm really getting at there is that very often the equipment that we're buying standardized equipment, we may have vessels of a particular size, equipment geometry and all the rest of it. So those physical facts of life, if you like, can have an influence on the process expectation as well. So it's a two-way dialogue.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And you have very nicely charted this or plotted this all out in some of the diagrams that are part of your paper, so folks can get an idea exactly how you envision that working. So this whole concept that we're talking about today, the intrinsic compliance, that we've just spent 45 minutes talking about. Can you talk about a little bit what your vision is in terms of what this means to the manufacturer, the manufacturing teams, the regulators, and then break it down to the patient? Like, what's the benefit here of this concept across the whole life cycle, if you will?
Okay, then I'll start with the manufacturer. I'll just take it. I won't say take it from the top. I should really begin with the patient, but I put the patient, the last shall be least, and all the rest of it. We'll come to the patient momentarily. But from the manufacturer's point of view, I think the benefits are synonymous with what I said earlier about Dr. Janet Woodcock. It gets Dr. Woodcock off your back, so to speak, in terms of efficiency, agility, and flexibility. I think those three adjectives are as descriptive of an optimized organization as they are of an optimized regulator. So I would say the benefits there would be efficient, agile, and flexible manufacturing, if I wanted to sell this to the boardroom, so to speak.
Right.
As far as teams are concerned, at the individual level, okay, job satisfaction, Stacey, for sure. I mean, some of the stuff that's being done in the name of compliance and qualification is so sort of painful and so demoralizing, particularly for young graduates coming out of university, brimming with intelligence. It can be quite anticlimactic to say, you know, I know you're a PhD in biotechnology, but we want you to behave as a clerk in terms of pencil pushing. So I would say that job satisfaction, motivation, morale, stimulation, all of those things. But energizing at the individual level, I would say.
And that's
important, if you want, from if you like, from
really important. We're trying to attract new talent in too, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. On the regulator side, okay, transparency, consistency, predictability of compliance, and it gets beyond. If you want to go back to warp speed, it gets beyond the rhetoric and says, okay, this is a very practical sort of a very feasible and a very practical interpretation, a response to the warp speed strategy at the manufacturing level. I have no doubt about that. And then at the patient level, I've always maintained, and as I get older, and even when I was younger, I was always very conscious of the fact that we as manufacturers and we as consultants, if we're not patients ourselves, we're related to patients. You know, we're either potential patients or potential consumers of medicine. So there is very strong connectivity in my mind between us as manufacturers and us as potential patients. So having said all of that, I would say that the regulator represents the patient really, and the ultimate sort of verification that product is safe really is compliance or the correspondence with quality target product profile, which is the label claim or the insert for the medicine. And I think I would say that the benefits to the patient really are that reassurance that the medicines that they are being dispensed are safe and efficacious, you know, from a chemical, a physical, a microbiological, and biological point of view, all of which would appear in the model. So they're not just sort of platitudes, but they're extremely testable criteria. So I think that would be that's probably it in terms of manufacturer, then manufacturing teams, regulators, and patients.
Sure. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, right? Produce the highest quality product for the patient at the easiest, most efficient, reliable as a manufacturing company. So right. So those two ends meet, come together to meet at the end.
Sure. I something I maybe should have mentioned at the beginning. It's kind of I said at the beginning that the industry, if you like, is divided into two work streams. You've got the qualification of systems and computers, number one,
right,
and then you've got the qualification of the validation of processes, number two. I think, and this is kind of a historical thing. I think what's happened, and it's been kind of this has happened incrementally. It kind of crept up on us. But what has happened incrementally, basically, is that it's always far easier to qualify a physical facility. All you got to do is say it's a no-brainer, and I'm not trying to.
Absolutely right. When things are static, it's a lot easier to validate that as opposed to continuously changing, like software.
Yeah, but I guess the point I want to make really is that, and I think this has been a kind of almost like a decoy within the industry, that it's almost as if people say, you know what, we don't fully understand our process, but we'll give you hundreds of thousands of pages of IQ, OQ for our physical facility. So we save the embarrassment of having to understand our process. And many people are still in that kind of mindset. New regs are kind of, how should I say, taking those people up, I think, quite significantly. If I compare that sort of, how should I say, focus with the new focus, I would trade all of those hundreds and thousands of qualification documents for one sheet of paper, which is a simple matrix which demonstrates process understanding, and it's just again a two-dimensional matrix with quality attributes of the product on one axis and unit operations on the other axis, and say, okay, you tell me collectively as an organization, where do these attributes, where are they initiated, where are they finalized, where are they tested, and where are they released? And that's if you can populate that matrix, then you understand your process and all of you. I'm not saying all of the other stuff goes away, but the other stuff it certainly plays second fiddle to that level of process understanding that I am sort of advocating.
Cliff, I think that you are exactly 100% dead on, because what we've seen, we talked about warning letters and the regulators' expectations and their comments back to us, and we are in fear of that. And what we've seen historically is that when process documents, or any of the documents, really SOPs, things are lengthy and not easily understandable and just cumbersome, people stop following them or they avoid them altogether. And so you bring in this concept with the matrices and really lining up the information quickly and easily. It can be accessed easily by all who are involved in the process. And it helps eliminate a lot of these avoidance mistakes or human errors, if you will, because it gives them a quick and easy, relevant frame of reference.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, Stacey. As I said, I've been at this at least 35 years. Crikey, Cliff, did it really take you 35 years for that penny to drop? And it probably did, But I'm hoping that at least it took a while for that penny to drop with me. But I'm hoping that the younger people that are listening would sort of reap the benefit of that sort of latent wisdom, if you want to call it that.
Right. No, and I do appreciate it. So I want to say thank you today for helping us understand a little bit more about this concept, but for also putting these matrices together and really bringing this idea to the forefront, and then of course joining me here today to discuss it. So as we wrap up today, Cliff, I just want to see if there's any last thoughts or strategies that you'd like to leave our listeners with before we close.
Yeah, one or two things come to mind, Stacey. Again, these sound like cliches, but I think they're pretty sort of significant. I would say join the dots. If you're within the validation world, join the dots within of pre-stage PV, which is what we've been talking about. If you're at a level higher, if you're at a leadership level, I would say join the bigger dots. What I mean by that is join your common technical document to your PV program, to your control strategy program. And there's a new one now, the SDHQ 12, which talks about the life cycle guidance. It's only a couple of months old. There's an expectation there for the registration and maintenance of established conditions. That's another regulatory expectation. So I would include that in the dot joining initiative. And that's one thing. Know your process. Pictorialize your. I'm a great believer in pictorialization, Stacey. I've gathered that from the paper. I think we tend to hide, sometimes deliberately, in literature. I simplify and pictorialize your manufacturing process, number one, and your validation workflow, number two. Another thing. Read the regulations or read the guidances. Again, I think people, things go wrong. Industry wouldn't be getting warning letters and citations if the guidances had been interpreted precisely. So I would urge practitioners, people who are at the whole face of validation, to not necessarily to accept their corporate policies as gospel, but to go back to the regs, read the regs.
And understand the regs. Don't just read them, understand them, right?
Yeah. I'll give you a classic example of that. For me, the first thing, the thing that struck me, I mean, but nobody really does this, but at their cost, the controls. If you read the expectation from both ICH and FDA in and around control strategy, without getting into a huge amount of detail, Stacey, if you do control strategy correctly, which is pretty much what I've been talking about with my relational data anyway, if you execute that strategy with a little bit of a checklist at the bottom of it, that is your protocol. You don't have to do any recreation or reinvention of data to actually satisfy the IQ, OQ, PQ, PV expectation. So recognizing shortcuts, if you like, within the life cycle would be another recommendation. And then I would say identify systems thinkers and what I would call interdisciplinarians, people a bit like myself who have a kind of a broad-minded view of manufacturing as opposed to so I'm a kind of a methodologist rather than an SME. Now I guess you could say I'm an SME in methodology. I would identify people like myself internally. I would describe them as general practitioners. I'm not saying that we disregard the SME component, but add some general practitioner capability to your teams. That would be another recommendation. And we mentioned earlier in terms of the org chart, if you are stuck in a silo, I'm repeating myself here, identify your handshakes and your handshakers. And finally, I guess for younger listeners, I would say respect your elders up to a point. If your elders are au fait with emerging regulation, then they deserve maximum respect. But if they're for whatever reason unaware of emerging regulation, if I was a young practitioner and I was being interviewed, if I had my annual assessment and it was a two-way dialogue, I would ask the interviewer at the leadership level, what's first policy and what's the timing on the inclusion of conditions within our policy. It was issued as an ICH guidance in March, I think March of this year. So where are we at as an organisation in terms of responding? So that's the type of kind of aggressive curiosity that I would urge the younger people to enjoy or to exhibit. And finally, then I think the final one really, Stacey, I would say if you're down in the weeds within the organisation, I think perhaps people would consider what I'm describing as an absolutely radical and as a paradigm shift. I think if you're a patient, if you're a recipient, a patient who is far more on her mind or his mind than the minutiae of IQ, OQ, I would say that this is fine tuning rather than paradigm shift, and I would sell it. I would promote it accordingly. That I'm just lobbying for some evolution rather than revolution.
I agree, Cliff, and we are happy at IVT to be able to bring some of this information forward to our listeners and our readers. So we'll have links for folks to follow up. Cliff, I appreciate you being here with us today. It's been great to chat with you about this. And I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Lastly, I have a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you on that. You can send us a quick email or ping us on one of our social media. We are very active on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and be sure to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.